It's the OG Fact Checker, here to give you a juicy tidbit of history that's verified. It's May, and that means it's time to recognize the contributions Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders have made to American history. I originally posted this episode in May 2025, but I'm always trying to improve, which is why I'm redoing the episode with updated information. I want to tell you the story of a woman who believed that fighting for freedom was more important than her own safety or even her life. She was the original thriller in Manila, and what she experienced went far beyond a mere boxing match between Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier. Let me introduce you to Florence May Ebersole from Santiago, Philippines. That's her birth name, but this half-Filipino, half-American woman is generally known as Coast Guard Spars veteran Florence Ebersole Smith Finch, who was a POW before she joined the Spars. She was awarded the precursor to the Presidential Medal of Freedom for her sub rosa work as a civilian during the Japanese occupation of her country. That's a lot to process, right? How did a half-Filipino, half-American woman get into spy work sabotaging the Japanese? How did she wind up joining the Coast Guard? And why is her name Florence when her birth name was Loring? Tune in for the scuttlebutt and more on this World War II heroine, Florence Finch, in this episode titled, She's a Tough Old Bird. Florence May Ebersole, who was known as Betty her entire life, was born in the Isabela province of Philippines in October 1915. Her father, Charles Ebersole, was a U.S. Army veteran who had fought during the Spanish-American War in Philippines and decided to stay there when the U.S. took over the island. Her mother, Maria Hermosa, was Filipino. I'm going to segue for a second and give a little twisted history geography lesson that might explain how Finch got her first name changed from Loring to Florence. One source I used didn't know how this happened, but another source I used gave a brief mention. I did some digging, and the change is possibly the result of America's colonization of Philippines during the early 20th century and the education system set up to uniform the country. Philippines is actually an archipelago, or a group of islands near Malaysia in Southeast Asia, bounded by the South China Sea in the west and the Pacific Ocean in the east. There are 7,100 islands that make up Philippines, and the three biggest island groups are Luzon in the north, which has the capital of Manila, Visayas, which is in the middle section, and Mindanao in the south. There's a lot of talk about European colonization and what the U.S. government did to the indigenous American tribes, but there isn't a lot of mainstream talk about the territories the U.S. possesses and how they were colonized. When the U.S. took possession of Philippines from Spain in 1898, there was an uprising by the inhabitants of the island, and revolutionary Emilio Aguinaldo, a half-Chinese, half-Filipino, wanted to establish an independent republic. The Filipinos fought U.S. forces from 1898 to 1901, which claimed 200,000 Filipino lives and 4,200 American lives. When the smoke cleared in 1902, the Filipinos admitted defeat, and the U.S. proceeded to colonize the island under President William Taft. The U.S. government needed to win the hearts and minds of the more influential Filipinos who didn't want a repeat of the mismanagement by Spain, but weren't interested in a bloody revolution. So, while the fighting was going on, the U.S. said, "Hey, Filipinos, we know you went through a lot with Spain, but we will be taking over your land and people because we won you fair and square in a war. And, like the song Proud Mary, we can do this easy or we can do this rough. But if you give us a chance, we promise you some degree of autonomy, really great social reforms and economic development. In 1907, Philippines had its first elected assembly, and in 1916, the Jones Act promised the island its independence, which was eventually granted in 1946. Part of those social reforms included education that claimed to prepare the Filipinos for when they would fully govern the island. Normal boarding schools were established, like the ones set up in the U.S. for freed Black slaves to prepare them for self-sufficiency that I talked about in episode 5, 3 Times the Charm, on the first Black men to join West Point. These schools were also similar for the ones that were established for indigenous children from various tribes to assimilate them to American ways by stripping away their language and culture. Many of the children forced into those schools would become part of the famous Navajo code talkers of World War II, who would ironically use their native language to relay critical combat information. You can learn more about these amazing exploits in episode 21. They didn't break code, they made code. In Philippines, there is religious, ethnic, and cultural diversity within the population of approximately 80 million people today. In terms of religion, there are Hispanic Catholics, the result of Spain's 333-year rule, Muslims, and animists, who are indigenous to the island and treat inanimate objects such as trees, rocks, plants, animals, etc., like animate objects that have souls and are spiritual. For example, if you've ever watched Disney's Moana, that entire movie is about animism in a nutshell. As you can imagine, this diversity impacts the languages spoken. 87 languages and dialects currently exist. While English is the official language and is spoken all over the country, Filipino, with an F, is also the national language. Before the country's 1972 Constitution was enacted, Filipino, spelled with a P, used to be primarily spoken by those in the Luzon region and was based on Tagalog. Filipino does differ from Filipino in that the latter incorporates all the languages, the national lingua franca spoken on the archipelago. The U.S. government couldn't wrap its head around all this diversity. On top of that, the U.S. believed that the country wouldn't be able to govern itself with all this diversity and needed a national identity, which in the U.S. is white and maintained through racial segregation. How on earth do you apply the concept of segregation to the Philippines, a country where whites aren't the dominant race and the population has a mix of Chinese, Spanish, and indigenous peoples? How do you weed out the useful people from the semi-useful ones? With religion, of course. Let's separate the practicing Christians from the ones who don't by setting up free, separate, but unequal American-led schools. And let's teach all of them English because there are too many languages spoken. Everyone speaking English will foster that national identity this island needs. When these schools first opened, all kids received the same education, but in separate schools. There were low-funded schools for the Muslims in the southern islands in Mindanao, and ones for the Igorots, or the Animists, a group of indigenous peoples in the Cordillera region in northern Luzon. But not too long after the schools opened, the curriculum changed. The Muslims were primarily taught to be enforcers for the U.S. The Igorots were only taught manual labor skills and how to assimilate into this new world order through the U.S. lens of being a savior to them. But the Christians, or rather the Catholics, were taught civics and literacy so they could participate in government. The low-funded schools were eventually closed, and only a small percentage of the non-Christian students attended the American schools. Filipinos like Finch were labeled American mestizos, or Tisoy, and the one-drop rule worked in the Philippines. If you had one drop of white American blood, you were seen as worthy of attention and professional development. And if you think about it, this takes a page right out of the American plantation owner's playbook, the psychology behind elevating one group of people over another, where slaves who were light-skinned or could pass for white, normally the slave master's offspring, were house slaves and not field slaves. This is probably how Florence Finch, who was born in the Luzon region, wound up attending a boarding school for mixed-race girls, where her name was changed from Loring, which is Germanic in origin and means renowned fighter, to Florence. Why it had to be changed or why they or she chose Florence, we won't never know. But this may explain why she wasn't taught manual labor, which was a really good thing when you find out what she did for the war. Finch's first job out of high school was as an assistant business manager at a YMCA, the place where she met her first husband, Charles Smith, a chief electrician's mate in the U.S. Navy, who she married right before the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941. Unfortunately, 7 months later, she was a widow. Her husband was killed in action. But when she was married, she started working for U.S. Army intelligence, assisting who would be later Lieutenant Colonel Edward Englehart, second in command for the Army Intelligence Branch in Philippines. The Army decided to pull out of the island once they knew the Japanese were about to invade. When Manila fell to Japan in January 1942, Finch stayed behind to care for her younger sister. She said in an interview, "I had no choice but to remain in Manila. I had a 16-year-old sister for who I was responsible. She had been living with me. We had no options whatsoever." When the Japanese started rounding up all the Americans and British for arrest, Finch was like, "I'm Filipino. I was born here," and managed to evade capture for the moment. After Army intelligence went dark on the island, Finch went to work for the Philippine Liquid Fuel Distribution Union as a secretary. And one of her duties was overseeing fuel ration cards. She used this position to create fuel rations with fake names for the Filipino resistance to help them disrupt Japanese shipments, distributing as much as 250 gallons of fuel a week. It's safe to say Finch was 10 toes down. And she didn't stop there. When she found out that her old boss, Lieutenant Colonel Englehart, had been captured and he and the British were living in substandard conditions at the Japanese POW prisons, she arranged to have food and medicine smuggled in. She even did minor things like getting them clean laundry and soap. And when she found out her husband had died, she doubled her efforts. Eventually, Florence Finch was caught by the Japanese 2 years later in October 1944 and was sentenced to hard labor in a women's prison camp. She was interrogated, beaten, and tortured with electric clamps on her fingers, but Finch was no snitch. She was freed when the island was invaded by American forces 4 months later in 1944. At the time of her release, she was 80 pounds. Finch exercised her American citizenship and relocated to Buffalo, New York in May 1945 to stay with her American auntie, where she recuperated briefly before being one of the first women and the first Asian woman to join the Coast Guard Reserve, or SPARS, in July 1945. SPARS is an acronym for the Coast Guard's motto, Semper Paratus, always ready. You can learn more about the Coast Guard SPARS in episode 28. It took an act of God to change the tide. Finch did it, she said, to avenge the death of her husband. As she was serving on board the USS LST-512, word reached her superiors somehow about her Sub Rosa work in Philippines, probably from Lieutenant Colonel Engelhardt, and she was awarded the Asiatic Pacific Campaign Ribbon in 1946, the first woman to receive that ribbon. In 1947, Finch was awarded the Medal of Freedom from President Harry Truman. After her discharge from the spars in 1946, she met and married her second husband, Robert Finch, when she was a secretary at Cornell University. They moved to Ithaca, New York, where they raised 2 children. They were married for 21 years before Robert passed away in 1968. In honor of her heroic actions, the Coast Guard named a building on their base in Honolulu, Hawaii after her, as well as a fast response cutter. Finch died in Ithaca, New York at the age of 101 in 2016. I love history. You came for the truth. Thank you for staying for the story.